Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox and welcome to a special 5-part series on popcorn and compliance. The podcast series where I look at compliance through the lens of Hollywood movies. This month I start a special 5-part series on the classic Universal movie monsters from the 30s and 40s. I mine 5 of them for compliance lessons learned. We include Frankenstein, Dracula, the Wolfman, the Mummy, and we conclude with the Invisible Man. Today we take up perhaps my favorite of the classic Universal monsters, the Wolfman. It is deeply psychological, and I find the compliance lessons fascinating for you to review. Last week we looked at Bela Lugosi as Count Dracula. Earlier in our special 5-part series, we began with Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster. Go back and check it out if you haven't done so. We'll look at The Mummy, and we'll conclude our series with Claude Rains as the Invisible Man. So sit back, get a big old bag of popcorn, and get ready to enjoy Timothy and Fiona talking to us and taking a deep dive into the classic Universal movie monsters. Lon Chaney Jr. in his seminal role and the one he will always be remembered for as the Wolfman.
Okay, let's unpack this. You might be thinking, seriously, a black and white horror movie from 1941, what's that got to do with modern corporate compliance? Well, stick with us because Lon Chaney Jr.'s The Wolfman. It's more than just jump scares. It turns out to be this surprisingly insightful case study. Lon Chaney Jr., your new compliance guru, who knew? So quick setup for anyone who maybe hasn't seen it. Lon Chaney Jr., he plays Larry Talbot. He's this guy returning home to his family estate, trying to reconnect with his dad, who he's kind of estranged from. And he's also, awkwardly trying to woo the local shopkeeper's daughter. He's basically a decent guy, an ordinary guy. But then, well, there's this fateful encounter. He gets bitten. And it's totally against his will, but under the full moon, he transforms, becomes a monster, unleashes chaos. What makes it so tragic, though, is that he keeps his humanity underneath it all. He's not like, say, Frankenstein's creation, who's made a monster, or Dracula, who sort of embraces being a vampire. Larry Talbot still has his soul, He's tormented by what the beast does. So our mission today in this deep dive is to pull out 5 really striking compliance lessons right from Larry Talbot's story. We're going to show you how good people, like Larry, can end up in these incredibly risky situations, and how systems, well, whether it's in a spooky old movie or a modern company, often just miss the critical warning signs. The goal, give you some powerful insights, things you can actually use to understand and maybe handle risk better yourself.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? How completely timeless these themes feel. That vulnerability, the human condition. It plays out in Gothic tragedy, sure, but also right inside the walls of modern corporation. There are these profound lessons there if you know where to look. The Wolfman isn't just a scary story, it's a powerful parable, really, about recognizing how risk can just creep in and escalate, often totally unnoticed. And it really highlights how crucial it is to design systems that account for these human factors, rather than just, waiting to catch the obvious bad guys.
That's a really important distinction. It shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from just hunting villains and more towards understanding vulnerability. Which brings us neatly to our first lesson. Ordinary people can become compliance risks. Think about Larry Talbot at the start, trying to do good things, reconnect with family, find love. There's nothing malicious there. But after that bite, boom, he becomes something he can't control. Under the moonlight, she transforms, causes havoc.
And that duality, it mirrors exactly what we often see in the corporate world from a compliance perspective. It's not always a quote-unquote bad actor involved in every violation, someone who sets out to be corrupt. Actually, a lot of serious problems come from, well, let's call them ordinary employees under extraordinary circumstances. The sources we looked at bring up the classic fraud triangle, sort of a foundational model for understanding this stuff. It points to 3 factors usually being present: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. Maybe an employee is under huge financial pressure personally. Or maybe the company set these crazy, unrealistic sales targets. That creates pressure. Then there's an opportunity, maybe weak controls, and then they rationalize it. Oh, it's just this once, or everyone else does it, or I deserve this. Right, so the real insight here, the takeaway, is that compliance programs has to be designed with this human weakness in mind. It's not just about rules. Training needs to go deeper into ethical decision-making, helping people navigate those tricky gray areas when the pressure's on. And monitoring, it shouldn't just assume bad intent. It needs to look for patterns of behavior. Things that might show an employee starting to slip, kind of like Larry Talbot's subtle changes before the full moon hits. We need to catch those shifts early. Because sometimes, just like in the movie, the risk really does come from within otherwise good people.
So it's not just about catching the obvious villains, but maybe preventing the Larry Talbots from ever becoming that risk in the first place. That's a big shift, isn't it? But I wonder, is it always easy to tell the difference? Don't companies sometimes struggle to know what's a real warning versus what just feels like background noise?
Oh, absolutely. That's a huge challenge. And it leads perfectly into our second lesson. Warnings ignored become disasters realized. Think about the Wolfman. The warnings are just everywhere. Locals whispering about werewolves, the whole folklore atmosphere, and then you get that incredible, direct, really poetic warning from Maria Ouspenskaya, the old Romani woman. She tells Larry, right, even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright. Crystal clear.
Couldn't be clearer, but what happens?
They're dismissed.
Yeah.
Just folklore, superstition, maybe exaggeration. Nobody takes it seriously.
And that pattern, my gosh, it's such a common failure in compliance, isn't it? Ignoring the red flags. Could be an internal whistleblower report that gets shoved aside, or a weird pattern of payments that nobody questions, or strange accounting entries that just get explained away. Companies do this all the time, rationalize away the risks until, bam, it blows up into a crisis. And regulators, like the DOJ, the Department of Justice, they've said again and again, ignoring warnings like that can be seen as negligence. It's not enough just to have a hotline if the calls are treated like, well, noise.
Exactly. The real insight isn't just having a warning system. It's about building a culture where that folklore, those whispers, those odd signs, isn't just heard, but it's actually believed and acted on, even if it sounds a bit out there at first. It means you have to investigate those whistleblower reports promptly. You have to document what you find meticulously. And crucially, you have to act on those findings. A culture that lets people dismiss red flags as just noise. That company is basically setting itself up for disaster. Just like in the film, the information was there, the warnings are all around. The failure wasn't a lack of data, it was the choice to ignore it.
That is a sobering thought. Makes you wonder how many corporate disasters could have been avoided if someone had just listened to the folklore.
It's a really profound question, and it links directly to our third point, which often makes the problem of ignored warnings even worse. The curse of silence and stigma. Think about Larry Talbot's journey. One of the most tragic parts is his isolation. His profound isolation. He really tries to tell people what's happening to him. He tells his father, he tries explaining to friends, but what does he get? Disbelief, ridicule, or just silence. This massive stigma builds up around his condition, and it stops him from getting the help he desperately needs. He's trapped by fear of how people will see him.
And wow, does that resonate with the experience of corporate whistleblowers? It really does. So often, employees who step up, who find the courage to raise concerns about misconduct, they don't just get ignored. Sometimes they're actively pushed aside, marginalized, or even face retaliation. The result? Predictable, sadly, silence. And we've seen it time and time again in big scandals. Silence lets the problems fester, allows misconduct to just thrive in the dark. You know, the DOJ's 2024 guidance on evaluating compliance programs, the ECCP specifically talks about this. It stresses how critical it is to encourage reporting. And not just that, but to keep whistleblowers in the loop about what's happening with their report and absolutely crucially protect them from retaliation.
Absolutely. So the practical advice here is really clear. Companies have got to actively work to break that curse of silence. That means building a culture where people genuinely feel safe and empowered to speak up without fearing the consequences. Reporting channels need to be confidential, obviously, and there has to be a zero-tolerance policy for retaliation, enforced seriously. Whistleblowers, they need to be seen as allies, right? Allies of protecting the company's integrity, not threats. If you don't break that stigma, you risk letting problems grow completely unchecked, just like Larry Talbot's curse grew while he was trapped in silence.
Yeah, it's stark when you put it like that. That fear of speaking up, whether you're turning into a werewolf or you're an employee saying something wrong, it can be devastating. It stops any chance of early intervention, which, as we'll see, has terrible consequences. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Lesson number 4, risk is cyclical and predictable. Back to the movie. Larry Talbot's transformations, they're not random, are they? There's a pattern, a clear, predictable cycle. The full moon comes, it triggers the change. He becomes the Wolfman. Once you understand that pattern, the danger, while still terrifying, is at least anticipatable. You know when it's coming.
Exactly. And that's precisely how compliance folks need to start thinking about risk inside their organizations. Things like corruption, fraud, other kinds of misconduct. They're actually rarely just random bolts from the blue. More often, they follow these discernible cycles, or they tend to pop up during predictable full moons in the corporate calendar. What are those full moons? Well, think about intense pressure at the end of the quarter to hit numbers, or moving into a new high-risk country, or the chaos that often comes with mergers and acquisitions, even big disruptions in your supply chain. These are all times when risks tend to spike, vulnerabilities get exposed, like the moon getting full. So the key insight here is shifting compliance from being just reactive cleaning up messes to being proactively anticipatory. How do you do that? Well, you use tools like data analytics, deep risk assessments. You use them to map out your organization's specific risk cycles. Where are your pressure points? Once you know them, you can build your monitoring systems around those points. Anticipate where and when misconduct is most likely to rear its head.
It's like the villagers in the movie. Once they understood the pattern, they could brace themselves for when the Wolfman would appear. Compliance needs to do the same for its own organizational risks.
Right, so understanding those full moons lets companies prepare instead of just constantly reacting after the fact. That makes sense. But what's the biggest hurdle in getting companies to actually do that, to move from just recognizing the cycle to acting proactively?
Often it's the human element again, isn't it? Complacency is a big one.
Yeah.
That feeling of, oh, it won't happen here, or just the sheer difficulty of changing how things have always been done, inertia. But it's so essential. And that leads us right into our fifth and final lesson, which kind of ties it all together. Tragedy comes from a lack of intervention. When you boil it down, the Wolfman is it's a tragedy, a profound one. Larry Obbett's father, his son, is desperately pleading with him, but he refuses to believe. Authorities, they dismiss his warnings. Friends ignore his fears. The crucial point is nobody steps in effectively until it's way, way too late. And this cumulative failure, this pervasive lack of intervention, leads directly to Laurie's destruction.
Yeah.
Kills the man and the monster. It's a story of neglect leading to an inevitable, sad end.
And that pattern, gosh, it's depressingly familiar in so many corporate scandals. You mentioned the fraud triangle earlier, but think about real-world examples. Wells Fargo and their sales practices. Volkswagen and the emissions cheating. Countless FCPA cases, Foreign Corrupt Practices Act cases over the years. In almost every single one, dig deep enough and you find someone inside knew. The red flags were there, often waving furiously. But decisive intervention, it just never happened. Maybe out of fear, maybe complacency, maybe just willful blindness, pretending not to see. That moment where knowledge meets inaction, that's where catastrophe happens.
Yes, exactly. The compliance takeaway is incredibly stark here. Timely intervention, that's the difference, the critical difference between a near miss you can fix and a full-blown scandal that can destroy reputations, cost millions, even billions. Compliance officers, they need the authority, they need the resources, and crucially, they need the independence to step in early and act decisively. It's not enough for boards and executives to just talk about compliance. They have to actively empower their compliance teams, not just to spot risks, but to do something about them when they see them, without that real commitment to intervention. Well, the story of the Wolfman serves as a pretty potent warning. Tragedy in some form becomes almost inevitable.
Yeah. The Wolfman's fate really hammers home how doing nothing, how inaction leads to damage you just can't undo. Whether it's a literal curse or a corporate scandal, it's a powerful lesson way beyond the movie screen. So let's try and wrap this up. As we've unpacked all this, Lon Chaney Jr.'s Wolfman, he's not just a monster icon, is he? He kind of represents this vulnerability that's in all of us, maybe, especially when we're under pressure, when things conspire against us. The big lessons seem to be about designing systems in our companies and our organizations that recognize that human weakness, support people, and mitigate the risks before things get destructive, preventing the transformation in the first place.
Precisely. So the job of compliance, then, it isn't just hunting down the bad apples after the damage is done. It's about being deeply proactive. It means really listening to those warnings, like the villagers should have, protecting whistleblowers with real commitment, anticipating those predictable risk cycles, those corporate full moons we talked about, and crucially, intervening decisively at the very first signs of trouble. You know, the DOJ and the SEC, they might not use werewolf metaphors in their guidance, but their core message is exactly the same. Prevent the risk before it transforms into something uncontrollable and devastating.
Okay, so here's maybe a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on as you go about your day. Once that transformation happens, once the Wolfman is truly loose inside your organization, no compliance officer, no matter how good they are, can really undo the damage that's already been done. So the real question is, How can you make sure your organization acts before that full moon rises? How do you prevent that irreversible change? Thank you for joining us on this. Well, this surprisingly relevant deep dive into the Wolfman and its timeless lessons for compliance today. We hope it's given you something valuable to think about, maybe even apply. We'll catch you next time.
This is Tom Fox again. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of our special series on popcorn and compliance on the classic Universal monster movies. I hope you've enjoyed the Wolfman. He's really my favorite monster, and I hope you will join us again next week where we return to Boris Karloff in his seminal role as the Mummy, where he plays a 2,000-year-old character reincarnated in 1930s London. I also hope that you enjoyed my special guest host, Fiona and Timothy. They are AI-generated hosts, so if you have any comments on their performance as host, hope you'll put them in the show notes or shoot me an email and let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you. This series is a special production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.